My name's Nate Dearden, and I work at the State Board of Education. I am our Student and Family Rights Coordinator. And what that means is I'm on a team of folks who do a lot of students and families around civil rights, mainly. And one of the roles that I play is I work a lot with special ed dispute resolution, which means when families have challenges or concerns in working with the school, they can reach out to the USBE and access certain things. And so a lot of what I do is kind of work with schools and families to problem solve. My background is I'm an attorney, but I've been doing special ed related work for the last 10 years. And prior to that, did work with families in crisis and home. So I'm passionate about working with families and kids, but I know you all bring a lot of expertise to the table. Audra invited me to help with this a while back, and it's just been rumbling around in my head. And I did reach out to a few colleagues, but I just want to start out by saying I don't consider myself an expert in this either. So I will definitely benefit from your comments in the chat box and your questions, and we can have some conversation there. What I'm hoping to present today is a little bit about special ed laws and protections, and maybe some ideas that I have had of how those connections can probably be better made. And I think one of the biggest areas in a lot of educational kind of barriers for students with disabilities is just communication, awareness, and understanding. And so I hope today to bring a little bit of what I know to the table with that, but I definitely want you to comment and chat so that we can build broader understanding. So I prepared a few slides, and I will share my screen. Let's see what we got here. And I'll count on Audra to tell me if something's not working in terms of viewing this. So what I want to start off with is this is a quote from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it's in the preamble of the federal law. This law was passed in 1975, and this is probably my favorite quote from the law. It says, "Disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the right of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. Improving educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities." Now, I don't want to get too soapboxy, but what I'll say is I spent the beginning of my special ed legal career in the Washington, D.C. area. I grew up here in Utah, but ended up out there after law school. And I did a lot of policy work for students with disabilities kind of in the high school age group. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit more in the future. But while I was there and kind of doing that work, I learned a lot about what life looks like for folks with disabilities who are adults, and students, what their lives are like after they leave us. And it was very disheartening to learn that many individuals with disabilities live below the poverty line. Many are not involved in what we call integrated or competitive employment, meaning many folks do not work with folks who don't have disabilities. Many folks do not work. And although we have made great strides in the last 50 years, there are still many individuals with disabilities who live rather isolated lives and also very, very dependent on others. And although some of that is going to always be part of the lives of some folks with more significant needs, some of the dependency is something that is learned and supported by a system that is kind of built on our mindsets. And so as I looked at this quote again, preparing for this presentation, I thought again of how this topic, driver education, and kind of leading to that driver's license and ability to drive for many of our students with disabilities, how it aligns with this mission that we have of improving educational results. When students do not have a driver's license, when they don't maybe have that opportunity to drive, it is more likely that they will be isolated from kind of their community, from potential employment opportunities that would allow them to become more economically self-sufficient. And so I just saw some really neat connections that I hadn't thought of. So it says, Audra says my mic is buzzing and I don't know why either. I haven't had any issues. Maybe I'll mute and unmute real quick. Or Audra, I could log out and log back in if you think, because I don't want it to be a distraction to people. So I wanted to touch on a few of the federal laws for students with disabilities. And in terms of students in your school and what our student population looks like, all students with disabilities qualify for protections under Section 504 and Americans with Disabilities Act. These two laws were passed in the past, and they were designed to provide reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities so they could access government programs, and that includes state programs. And that's kind of one foot in the door to how students with disabilities get accommodations in the public school setting. There are some laws or case law. I didn't do an extensive case research, but there are some cases in other states showing that, you know, if a school is offering a driver education program in their school setting with school resources, sometimes even if it's been a private program, that school was required to provide some accommodations for access because it was basically being held out as a public offering to students who were enrolled at the school. I think an important component of this, though, and I didn't put this on the slide, is that the accommodations granted to students under Section 504 in the Americans with Disabilities Act, they are supposed to be reasonable accommodations. And what that means is it cannot be in an accommodation that would constitute a fundamental alteration of the program. And I hope to talk about that a little bit today. I think as it's my limited understanding, you know, that you're working within rules and regulations kind of set forth by the driver's license division. And some of those things are not subject to change. They are essential components of the program. And so I think as you're working with individuals with disabilities, the idea is that they can qualify for reasonable accommodations, but it's not going to be something that's going to cause a fundamental alteration. Sorry, I'm having someone else kind of talk about the feedback, and I don't know what to do because I don't usually have feedback issues with my computer mic. So I've sent Audra a little message. So yeah, Nikki, we're going to talk a little bit about how the standards apply, but what I want to talk about this next federal law, and then we're going to jump into kind of some application in a few minutes to kind of think this through. But I'm glad you're thinking about, we've got standards, we've got requirements, and so we want to be aware of accommodations that students might need while still kind of upholding the integrity and the rigor of that program. The last federal law, okay, great. I'm going to give an example, I think, of some fundamental alterations when we get a little bit more into the details. So great question, and stay tuned for that. The last law that applies is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so what I'll explain is that Section 504 in the ADA, those are civil rights laws. And the purpose of those laws is to prevent discrimination. These laws apply to any individuals with disabilities whose disabilities impair a major life activity, which the laws talk about can be learning, breathing, walking. So it's a more broad level approach. And some of these students may have 504 plans. Some of these students may not even have a plan at the time that we're working with them. When we think about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, it is a more involved act, and it is a educational programming. It comes with funding that the other two laws don't. And it goes beyond just providing accommodations to providing what we call special education, which is specially designed instruction that can help students access and make progress in the curriculum. And a key part of this law, as well as the other two, is that students are entitled to participate in non-academic and extracurricular and all the kind of activities and things that their peers are participating in, and that it is our job to kind of provide access and remove barriers to that participation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about IDEA, and kind of that's going to be a lot of our discussion, because those are some of the students who may need more support and kind of more assessment. I want to remind us that before 1975, there was no IDEA. So there were not students. Congress did an investigation, and there were millions of kids who were not allowed to come to school and could not participate in public education. There weren't resources given to them, and so there were some pretty big barriers. That said, I think when we think about our students with disabilities, some of us who have less experience working with folks with disabilities, we may think a lot of folks with physical disabilities, folks we see out about in the community in wheelchairs, or walking with canes or other assistive devices. We may think of folks who are blind. We may think of, those are some of the things that we call visible, or, disabilities that you can see. But what we found in the last 30 years and 50 years especially, is that a large portion of our students with disabilities in public schools have what we call hidden disabilities. They're not visible. And so there are students who have ADHD, or attention and learning difficulties is a huge one. Our biggest percentage of kids with disabilities, about between 60 and 70% of kids in high school or in schools with IEPs have learning disabilities. And that may mean dyslexia, it may mean a math disability, it may mean they are slower processors, so they can get there, but they take longer than some of their peers. As you're probably aware, we're also seeing a large percentage of kids with autism on the autism spectrum. And so I think sometimes for folks who are a little less aware of kind of those demographics, we may think driver's ed and kids with disabilities, and think of our students who are blind or who have some more significant challenges, and think, well, that's not, those kids are not going to end up getting a driver's license. And it is true that some students may have such significant disabilities that they would not be able to qualify under those requirements set forth by the state. But there are a lot of kids who have learning challenges who, with the proper supports, may be able to access and make progress in this way if we are able to work together as a team. Okay, Audra's answering one of my questions that I was going to get to, so that is awesome. And I am going to be, so are there any accommodations for a student with an IEP that can't pass the written exam? I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, Ryan, but I'd love for other audience participants to be able to kind of speak to that as well. And I'll share just the limited kind of ideas that I have connected to that.
Nate, let me answer that question really
Okay,
quick. If it
great.
has to do with the written exam or the road exam, no accommodations can be made. It has to be done at the driver's licensing office because those exams aren't ours. When it
Yeah,
comes to class, then yes, there's all kinds of accommodations that you should be doing and have to be doing. And she will go over what accommodations can be for your classroom and for your car. And that somebody asked a question before about what some examples of how to accommodate, and she'll get into that a little bit later. But if it has to do with the test that we give on behalf of DLD, we're not allowed to accommodate. They have to do it at the driver's licensing office. I do not know if they do a good job of it or not, but that's where it's required to be done at, and I can speak to them about that. If you have a specific issue or concern, have that parent reach out to me and I can work with driver's licensing.
great. And I see some connections with that. So I think we can chat a little bit, but that's great, Audra. Thank you. Um, so these are some pieces of the IDA, and what I want to point out is that they talk about the importance of having high expectations for our students, being prepared to help them lead productive and independent adult lives. And they talk about some of these components that are key for this IEP or individualized education program process. And I understand you may not always be a part of that process, but I want you to know what it is and what some of our students with disabilities are entitled to, so that we can communicate together and kind of make those connections that are sometimes missing. Part of an IEP and part of the IDA is that students are entitled to special education and related services, aids and supports. And I'll talk a little bit about that because I know those are kind of not super clear terms if you're less familiar, as well as assistive technology devices and services. And so this is kind of the bedrock of the IDA, or some of these components, and I think they connect a lot to the work that you do. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is the IEP is created by a team of folks. The way that a student qualifies for an IEP is they have to have a disability, and under the law, there are 13 different categories. Those are not diagnoses, they're categories. And we look at things from an educational perspective. And so when you look in the outside world, particularly, for example, with the driver's license division, they sometimes tend to look at disability as more of a medical model. When you think about any driver has to kind of show that they're medically fit to qualify for a license and to operate a motor vehicle, and they may be looking for diagnoses, and they're going to look for an evaluation from a medical professional if that's something that's necessary for an individual. In the education realm, we're really looking at how the student's disability impacts their ability to learn. It impacts their functional performance and their behavior. And if we see that the disability is having an impact such that they would benefit from services to help them access and make progress, that's how a student would qualify. But when they qualify, we create an IEP together as a team. And the part that is key here, I think, is that there are different team members that are required, and then there's some optional team members. Parents are a required part of the team. At least one regular education teacher, at least one special education teacher. We have a position on the team called the LEA representative, but that is typically the principal or the assistant principal. It's somebody who's able to kind of preside over the process, who can commit resources. But then you'll see we've got folks who can interpret instructional implications of evaluations, which is really key, especially when we're deciding if a student is eligible or tweaking their plan. And then two big pieces that I think are applicable here: at the discretion of the parents or the LEA. When I say LEA, I'm talking about local education agency, which is just a public school district or a charter school. That's kind of the language in the federal law. So anytime I say LEA, it's just a school. So the parents or the school, they can invite anyone who has knowledge or special expertise regarding the student. And that can often be related services personnel. So some related services folks who often come are speech language pathologists or speech technicians, occupational therapists, physical therapists. When I was doing a little bit of research, it looks like occupational therapists can sometimes be a helpful member of the team to help kind of look at supports for students with disabilities in this realm. But a driver education teacher could be part of that team, depending on just if they felt like inviting that person would help the team kind of have some information that they may not otherwise have, and to share information with each other and problem solve together to plan for a student. There's an interesting component in the IDA for students who are 14 and older. We are required to invite them to be part of the IEP team, and not every student ends up attending, but many will. And so I think it's important, where we're kind of talking about the driver ed age group, the student can be somebody at the meeting and hopefully should be. What I'll say is these plans, or the programs, the IEPs, are reviewed once a year. And but they can be reviewed more frequently if the team notices that there's a need, or the parent or student brings a need and we're noticing that we need to make some tweaks and change the plan. But especially in the secondary level, not all of the teachers can come, and we understand that. And so a key piece of this too is, even if as a driver education teacher you cannot come, but you need to know some of the information we're going to talk about, that document can be shared. And the law requires that the document be shared with any professionals within the school who would be responsible for providing accommodations or services or supports under that plan. And they need to be aware of what their part in providing that is. And so I do think with some students, it would be very helpful to involve the driver education teacher in the planning piece, because it's helpful to kind of be there for that conversation when we talk about those accommodations to instruction that may need to be made in kind of the different realms for different students. So I'm trying to keep things somewhat simple, because I know, we're all at different places in this process, and I'm not sure how many of you are very familiar with IEPs. You could always go and ask to look at a copy if you know you have a student, and I hope you know which students have IEPs who take your classes, because I think if you don't, that's a missing piece. Although I bet it happens a lot, and Audra and I talked a little bit about that. The key thing is that it's a legally binding document, as well as that team developed process. And it has different pieces in it, and some that I think are applicable to our audience are, there's typically annual goals, and those will be centered around areas that the student can struggle in. So many students may have a reading goal or several reading goals, math goals, behavior goals, speech goals, communication, just kind of wherever they struggle, they will often have some goals outlining what they're going to accomplish that year with the help of the school. And connected to those goals, students should have services. They should have accommodations that are appropriate. What I always try to remind teams is this I in the IEP stands for individualized. And so it really should be based on a foundation of what they need. So there is a piece at the beginning of the plan called the present level statement that kind of outlines where some of their struggles are and how their disability impacts them. And that should guide the rest of the plan. But as you can see, I've outlined some other things that the team's required to include and pay attention to. And one of those is test participation. And that is more along the lines of statewide testing. So, the RISE, the ASPIRE, things of that nature. But what I think is helpful, and kind of as I thought through this topic, is alignment, that students who struggle in reading, math, some of their core classes and other classes, those same ways their disability impacts them will probably impact them in a driver education class. And so it's extremely helpful to kind of look at what are some student accommodations in core classes or their regular classes that could be adapted or embedded in your driver education classes. And some of those accommodations include things like preferential seating. Some kids do better seated at the front of the classroom. They get less distracted, or they're able to retain that information a little bit more. Some kids need to what we call special education services, where part of their special ed service is they're taught certain vocabulary words ahead of time, so that as those words arise in the lesson, they're more familiar, or they are retaught those words and those concepts following the lesson. This may be an area that IEP teams tend to neglect, but just like kids get specialized reading and math services at times, there may be some elements, especially with the reading and writing portions of driver education, that it may be helpful to kind of say, this is what they're doing in reading. And it could be helpful to do similar things with the content in this class because of how their disability impacts them. Similarly, I know we've got some students who have some behavioral challenges and need a little bit of support, and assistive technology is something that the team will review and look at. So for those transition age students I mentioned earlier, or kiddos who are 14 and older, part of that IEP meeting is planning a transition plan, which looks at their goals, their post-secondary goals in the areas of employment, education and training, and independent living. And the team is required to do some kind of assessment with the students. It can be pretty informal, like an interview or a survey about what they want to do for life after high school. And this is a time when students are kind of 14 and 15, where the team should really start planning to help them develop that vision. And I think that's where this element should come up in the planning conversations. The team is required to assess areas of need. They're required to develop a course of study, which is the classes they would need to graduate and to kind of work toward those post-secondary goals, as well as they're required to kind of link to outside agencies if appropriate. And an agency that is often linked in this work is vocational rehabilitation. And they can offer supports to students as well as adults with disabilities who, as long as the supports are kind of connected to employment goals. And so I think for any of our students with disabilities who might need some support in accessing and passing driver education, this is a great space to do it in, is this transition planning element of the IEP, because everything's connected for me. I don't want things kind of discussed separately without the whole team, because all of these things are so interconnected. And so I wanted you to be aware that there's already this requirement. We monitor them at the state level to make sure that teams are developing them. And it's kind of that key piece in a student's life where maybe they weren't very involved before. And now we're bringing them to the table because we're saying when you turn 18, you're typically going to become the decision maker for yourself rather than your parent. And you're going to be preparing to enter college or training or employment, and you'll be the one who has to identify yourself as an individual with a disability and ask for accommodations. And so that's a key skill for you to have, and you need to be part of these planning conversations. Now, this is something that I think is key to kind of understand in the work that you're doing, as well as preparing parents to kind of work with the driver's license division. In an IEP, a student may have modifications as well as accommodations, but kind of as I spoke to earlier, that fundamental alteration piece. When you're dealing with ADA and you're dealing with Section 504, they entitle you to accommodations. But some families and students may be used to both of these things. And so I wanted to kind of point out the distinction. Accommodations help folks gain access. And so it is a change, it could be a change to instructional or testing procedures or material that allows a student to access the information and accurately demonstrate knowledge. So in the area of testing, what we see sometimes, and it depends on the content area, but for our statewide testing, an accommodation that some kids with dyslexia or learning disabilities get, for example, on the math portion, they may have a read aloud. So if they're a struggling reader, and because it's the math skills that are being tested, the test can read aloud the questions to them because their reading isn't being tested in that way. So they can access the math question, they can answer the math question. For some of our kids who have learning disabilities, writing things out is tricky, spelling is tricky. And so some accommodations with some tests include the ability to speak your answer rather than write it down. Those are some things that you'll often see. And I think a lot of tests and technology is developing, so you can get a lot of things kind of read aloud to you. When I touch base with my colleagues who work with kind of transition age youth to ask what their experience had been with the driver education piece, they spoke to this piece that Audra brought up, that when you're a student with a disability who needs accommodations, you're going to take that test, the permit test through the drivers, the DLD, and they'll determine the accommodations. But it's still going to be a similar process in that you probably need to present some evidence of your disability and how it impacts you, and you're going to request an accommodation. I did message them through their chat function last week and kind of asked, like, how do you have a list of what's available? And they said it's very individualized. But what I would say is from my colleagues that reached out, their experience sometimes was this reader component, that either a human reader could read it or technology could read it. But they talked about this idea that they just review each request as it comes, and they'll work with folks. And what I want folks to understand is under the ADA and Section 504, if you feel like you've been discriminated against on the basis of your disability and you were not given reasonable accommodations, then you can file a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights, and they will look into that. But I think this is a good point to kind of point out there's a distinction between accommodations and modifications. And as you see in the bottom, on the bottom left, accommodations don't change the content, they don't change the expectations, and they don't reduce the requirements. And so for someone who asks, what's a fundamental alteration? A fundamental alteration would be one of those things. And so if you've got a parent who's kind of advocating for their student and wants their student to learn less of the content or only a portion of the content, or they want to change kind of the expectations for how a student would show that they know that information, meaning that they didn't need to learn as much, or if we reduce the requirements of the task in such a way. I think when we're talking about driving, there's just certain things that we can't bend on because they become public safety and personal safety risks. And so I think this is definitely an area where there's certain things that there just can't be modifications. And so I think it's helpful for parents to know, because for some of our kids with disabilities, as they've been coming up in K through 12, that is a part of the IEP at times. There are sometimes changes to instruction or curriculum that alters the content, that simplifies it, that changes the expectation for learning or reduces the requirements. And I think it's helpful to kind of help parents understand this is a situation where modifications aren't a part of this process. We can have some accommodations. So if your student has a disability and needs help accessing, but they're still going to need to know the content. And in many ways with adaptations, they're going to need to be able to perform the physical requirements and the medical and health requirements that are there. So someone made the point, in Idaho as a tester, our last instruction was no accommodation. We were told not even allowing emotional support animals. What about Utah? Again, as I pointed out, ADA and Section 504 are federal civil rights laws that apply to state governments. So they apply to state government agencies. Emotional support animals actually do not fall under the ADA. Service animals do. And so if you have questions kind of about those distinctions and how they might apply, you would probably need to work with an attorney or work with your school administrators to kind of look into that, and then the driver's license division. I had not thought about kind of the intersection of service animals and driver education. So that's something to kind of put in my head to think about. As I was kind of doing some research, I found some really good resources out of a children's hospital in Pennsylvania. And these were some questions that they suggested having for parents. I think one of the challenges I had in preparing this presentation was thinking about all the different players who come to the table that you're all working with. We've got this state imposed process that we're helping prepare students for, but as we've talked about, we don't have control over all of that. And so I noticed that there's a lot of impetus on us as the educators and as the service providers to kind of be aware of what those requirements are as we help students prepare. But we've also got this private element that it's families who will be insuring their child. They'll be providing the vehicle that the child may be driving. And kind of like I tried to set our mindset in the beginning of the presentation, a lot of barriers for people with disabilities come from expectations, lower expectations, a lack of information. And there are parents every year that I talk to who have never dealt with anyone with a disability until they had their own child. And so I would suspect, because I've encountered them on my own, there are some parents who are very protective, who really don't want their student out in the community and kind of growing up and leaving the nest because there's a lot of fear about challenges they may face. And they may just have lower expectations because they don't know what's possible. And so I think engaging with parents and kind of helping them problem solve and work with you to see how we can make this a possibility for many students is key. But I really like these questions. These ones were gauged on a website that was more for students on the spectrum, but I thought we could, broaden them a little bit. But I liked that they pointed out this idea of, driving with somebody other than the parent, being able to take direction, medical and behavioral conditions that may impact your safety. Can your student receive constructive criticism and instruction? Do they have good judgment and maturity? And what I would say is that some of these skills are hard for kids with disabilities, but many of these skills can be taught. And so again, that's a key piece with IEPs and kids in high school is what are some ways that we can strengthen some areas of weakness and kind of help some of them work toward areas where they could get a little bit stronger and potentially be able to pass and qualify. So as I thought about kind of just the requirements that are up for that you're working with, we've got the written test, we've got the driver education course, and we've got this driving skills test. And so again, I think as you work with IEP teams and as you put your heads together with parents and with other folks in the school, I think depending on a student's disability, some kids may need some support with the written test. Other kids may not. I know that we've got some kids with physical disabilities, but they don't have cognitive disabilities. So they may pass the course just fine. They may pass the written test, but it's the skills test that's going to be tricky. And some of those students may need adapted vehicles. They may need some adapted equipment. And that's a conversation to have with family too. I didn't have time to include all this information, but there's a lot of stuff on the internet now about companies that offer this, ways that you can get evaluated and kind of figure out what might work for you as an individual with a disability. And so I think for each kid, looking at these different components of this program and kind of figuring out what accommodations may be needed is key. And some may need it in all three, and some may not need it in all of them. This just emphasizes what Audra has already spoken to. If a student needs accommodations on that test, the school cannot provide a reader, an interpreter, or anything else. But that said, I do want folks to kind of be aware that you can advocate for yourself with the driver's license division, but I think it's helpful to be able to show what students have received in their education process the last few years, what works for them. And it's again, being able to make an argument as a parent that you're not asking for a modification, you're asking for an accommodation that can help the student access. I also loved that we have these standards, and we're very big in Utah about having standards in all areas of instruction. And there's a big push nationally to have standards-driven IEPs. So as teachers and parents, I think it's key if we're developing goals and we're providing services to use some of these standards and pick out what are some areas where the student's a little weak, but with support could grow and probably become proficient, and really use this document to kind of help make connections to other areas of instruction and support. So the way that school personnel can work together is kind of getting us all together. We are sometimes going to need to work with medical personnel and physical or occupational therapists because they can give us useful information. I wanted to point out that if a student needs assistive technology to participate in a public school driver education course, that is something that we would need to provide because of those ADA and Section 504 protections. And if you ever had questions, you could reach out to Audra, you could reach out to some of your colleagues in the field, but we need to make sure that accommodations are being offered through our public offerings, which we've kind of talked about. I wanted to point out, and this comes from the DLD website, I think, that it's really a driver education teacher, if they have safety concerns, these are the things that they're going to look at. And so again, as I told you, we've got different kiddos with disabilities. Some of our kids are cognitively there, but attention, they struggle with attention. They struggle with staying on task and refraining from distractions. They struggle to kind of respond in a timely manner. Do I think some of these kids are incapable of doing that? No, but that's maybe where a behavior intervention plan may come in, or some supports throughout the day where we're teaching kids to kind of use to build and develop that skill, because if they don't build that skill, the teacher may not at that time feel that they are not a risk to other drivers. So I wanted to point out the functional ability in driving, and you're probably all familiar with this, but for parents, they may be less familiar because this may be new information to them. And so it does talk about if an individual has or suspected that they have a physical, mental, or emotional impairment, which may affect driving safety, they're going to need to seek that competent medical evaluation and advice about how that impairment impacts their safety. So I don't have any personal experience doing this, but Audra connected me to a teacher who had, and I kind of talked to her, and she said how key this is to kind of encourage families to do this, to get them to get their student evaluated so that you can be able to see if that's going to be a barrier or not. So I wanted to just kind of screenshot, this is what it looks like, but when I went on the website, they had kind of more individual breakdowns in these different categories. And so I picked one that I thought would be, that's often applicable because of the population of kids that we have. I picked the category F, learning, memory, and communication disorders. So this is for the private driving one. And again, if we have more time, I'd have some discussion on this. I'm trying to not talk too much. I'm nearing the end of my time to present, and then we'll have some questions. But as you think about some of our students, we may have students with slight intellectual or communication impairments, but they have good socialization and emotional control. So you can see just kind of different restrictions that may come into play depending on where they are at. And I think this could be another kind of piece to examine together as a team when you're problem solving around a particular student. And again, an accommodation is something that you can provide, or special education services that you can support that will help a student gain skills and make that progress. But I think it's kind of understanding what a student may need. So using these tools to kind of say, these are the benchmarks, how are we going to get our students there? So yeah, Barry has a good question. If a student requires additional hours of training, is there funding to pay the teacher for the additional training time? So Audra kind of points out, if these things are part of a student's IEP, and arguably even if they're not on the IEP, but that becomes something that folks understand as a need, that's where they would need to amend the IEP and add that to acknowledge that the student needed that support. And the school would need to work to provide funding or personnel to provide this support to the student. That is part of that civil rights element of the law. I want to make sure So Casey asks a question, what about an accommodation for earplugs to block out noise, but it is quiet. When you give direction, they say what, and take out the earplug and ask again. Not a big deal during class, but driving would be a problem. I think that is where you would discuss whether that becomes a fundamental alteration. And I think in many cases it would. You have to be able to hear and to be alert. So you guys are much more the experts on the driving piece than I am. But I think that is where there are just some things that are fundamental elements of the program that you can't take away. And so again, that's kind of that parsing out. Yes, when we're in class having instruction, if I'm having you work alone or you're doing things together and it's a little loud and that helps the student kind of not be distracted, that's maybe okay in class, but that's not an accommodation we're going to offer when we're doing the driving test, because that would be a fundamental alteration. And thanks, Audra. She's just got my back. She's taking care of everything. So I think Roy added to his question saying, does that include instructional time, drive time if a student needs extra time? And Audra's saying it could apply to both. It depends on the student's needs and what the team decides. I want to remind us that it's a team decision. So there are times where you probably encountered parents who want to ask for anything and everything. And it's okay to ask, but that doesn't mean we're always going to give it. It's again, we're trying to make reasonable decisions. We don't want to over accommodate students because we want to maintain that fading of supports as they're getting older, and we want to maintain as much independence as possible. So just a couple other tips from a practitioner in the field. She's up in Cache Valley, and I really appreciated the time she took to talk with me during her prep period a little while ago. And she just pointed out a couple more things. Again, as we talked in the beginning, you know, not all families, not all schools have high expectations because they don't know what's possible. And I have seen a lot of parents be really protective. So she pointed out that it's really important to encourage families, to encourage their kids to take it while they're still in school. I think sometimes families of students with disabilities, they have that hard time letting go, and they think we'll take it later, or there's too much going on. And so just kind of that balance between, here is a free public thing available to your student while they're with us. So let's take advantage of that if it's the right thing for this student. She talked about how some parents have wanted to borrow the school's adapted car, and that's obviously not allowed, but just kind of setting those boundaries that when they're with us taking part in the class or the instruction, that is something we need to provide. But for private driving time and for your family, like, you're going to need to adapt your car or get the tools that you're going to need to accommodate the student privately. She made a point that I thought was interesting. She says just her experience of working with kiddos who use wheelchairs, they're not always used to watching out for others. Because she said, everybody kind of gets out of your way when you're moving along in an electric wheelchair, or even if it's a manual one. And so she said she's noticed in her practice that some of those students need that explicit instruction and practice, to be able to realize, like, you just don't have the right of way all the time. You need to pay attention to those around you. And then she did share a couple of examples, which these questions have come up to, that sometimes just double the range time. She said she had a student who used hand controls, and she got permission to have that double time so they could just develop better skill and better practice with that. As well as we do have kids who just process a little bit more slowly. And I get that reaction time cannot be slow in driving, but some kids can learn if they just need that, they need that more practice and more comfort. Again, we've got students with mental health and anxiety issues, and some of those kids, the change, the responsibility, that's scary for them. But if they have the right practice and support, they can often get to where they can do this in a competent way. They just need the support. So I wanted to remind you of this resource in Utah Assistive Technology Teams. They're based through the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, but one of the things they can do is free consultations. So particularly if you have kids that may need some supports that you just haven't thought of before, they could do a free consultation, and the folks who work there are just, they've encountered so many things with folks of all ability ranges, and they can help you kind of figure out some assistive technology supports that may be helpful. And then this is just a resource I found online. I haven't vetted the entire thing, but I thought it was really interesting because I thought a lot about the work you guys are doing. This is such a parent partnership piece in your professional realm, because you're preparing these students, but they've also got to do this practice with their family. And so this Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, they have, and I linked it, but you could kind of maybe screenshot it or write it down, this teen driver source. And it gives you access to a bunch of little videos and an assessment that parents can use with their student that really goes through all these things that you would want to do as a parent to help your student be prepared, that goes above and beyond what they're going to be tested for their driver's license. And so, especially for a lot of our students with disabilities, a lot of it is just about explicitly teaching those skills. Some of them don't pick up on things the same way that typically developing kids do. But if we teach them explicit skills or break down the skills, they can make that. So that's awesome. Audra said it's on, maybe that's where I found it, was on their parent resources on our USB website. So I'd encourage you to look at that. And then just the last thing, I understand that this may not be an option for all of our kids with disabilities because of just some of the different challenges associated with your disability and how it may impact your ability to drive, and that's okay. And so I want to make sure that teams are also helping kids explore other options and develop skills to utilize those other options. So as they're working toward that goal, or maybe driver education is not something they're going to be able to access, that we understand, again, to prepare our kids for independent living, there are these other ways that we can help them to get around and kind of get their transportation needs. So this is my contact information, but I believe, I don't know, it's probably somewhere else too. I'm going to stop sharing. But that's kind of the material I prepared, and I hope that some of it was helpful to you. And I think if we've got other questions in the chat or in the Q&A, I'd love to see them, and Audra's been great at helping me out. Okay, and then someone's given me some
yeah, that's from something else.
Oh, okay.
That's it. Let me kind of also If you guys need assistance with a specific student, please reach out to me because I can set you up with the resources that you need and also give you the assistance you need and walk you through the steps. You know, you need to understand what the parents' goals are. Do they want the student to actually get a driver's license, or do they want them just to have the experience of all the other students? And you need to make sure you understand if the student has an IEP or a 504, and you need to know what it says, and you need to know who's on the team. You need to meet with them if other accommodations or modifications need to be made that come up in your area versus maybe English or math or something. You know, and if there's certain hand controls or different type of mechanisms, seat lifts, you know, whatever needs for the car, I can get you those. But if you have a specific student in mind and you're not sure whether you need to get them tested first, or if they went through the right process at the driver's licensing office, or if you have all of a sudden something becomes a conflict and you need conflict resolution, then it's going to go to go to our office. So I can help you with through the different steps that you, and the more you know about it and you know more that you know about the laws and what is required of you, then it'll help you and it'll keep you out of trouble for liability and issues that come up. So if you're not even sure where to start, please reach out to me and I can help you. But if you, and there's a lot of resources at every one of your schools. You know, you have your special ed teachers, you have a whole gamut of people at your schools that can help you navigate this. And if you don't know who to go to, reach out to me and I can tell you who it is at your school. So I just encourage you to learn more about it. Don't be surprised. I mean, you have students of all kinds in your schools, and you can't just expect that you're going to teach them all the same way. Driver's ed is no different than any of the other classrooms you teach during the day. Does anybody have any other specific questions for her before she heads out? And unfortunately, I have a whole gamut of lawsuits that I could give you that have to do with driver's ed. So please, let's not become one of them.
Well, I thought that's why I wanted to kind of focus on kind of mindset and problem solving and just kind of being aware. I love how Audra said, like, you know, the more you know about these laws, it helps. But I think for me, as long as you just kind of know a little bit, right? You need to know about this. So then when someone asks, you don't just say no, you say, let me check. Let me get back to you. And I think that as long as you know that and as you move forward, then that's great. And I think special ed folks are great at problem solving. That is something I've learned at working, and educators generally. So I think as long as we have that growth mindset and high expectations, we can do a lot together if we put our heads together and problem solve. So thanks for letting me join today. It was nice to be with you, and keep in touch if you need anything.
This is the time where you guys will learn how to use the blind copy. You need to communicate very well with these type of parents and document everything and keep copies of the documentation of what you said to them. Clarify what they mean, repeat it back, try to copy it, document it, and know that you've covered all of your bases. This is the time where you really need to pay attention to your communication.
Great point.
And if you guys have any other questions, she's going to be on all 3 days, so you can watch again if you need more information, and also we'll have our PowerPoint available. So if you feel like you really need to get more in depth with what's going on with special ed and driver's ed, watch again. I'm sure that, you know, as people present, they always go through different things. So you're welcome to watch again to get the information, or we can also provide you the PowerPoint. Thank you, Nate. That was awesome.
Thanks. We'll see you later.